So, continuing with our uh, brief history of Mexico since colonization, we saw that how 1810 Hidalgo's independence movement has led to the freedom of Mexico from Spain. And then we see the next important event is uh, called Porfiriato, that's roughly happened in between 1817 to 1911 is this uh, General Porfirio Diaz, who ran the country as a dictator. Late 1800 Mexico fluctuated with having leaders who were larger or lesser degree democratic or not, and this general was not democratic, and this was a period Mexico started developing economically. So this general was like, economics is not my area, and I do not know much about economics. So I'm going to turn it I'm going to turn um to economists who are not elected, and neither was I, says Diaz. So they run what we call technocratic dictatorship, um, um, simply because based on the idea that those who have knowledge of how to run the country has to run, especially economically. So they started this economic idea of attracting more foreign investment from Europe and US. And you see, the next thing you see is you have all this money uh, flowing from US and um, Europe. And then there is this roughly the period 1910, you have a Mexican Revolution. Two important groups uh, are fought against um, the dictatorship and for the establishment of democracy in uh, Mexico. We talk two revolution who work separately but also happens to work at the same time. Sometimes they work together, sometimes differently because they both had a different goals, but both were aimed at overthrowing the dictatorship. So we talk about this overlapping revolutions, at times working together, but at the same times working separately. So the first group is um, middle class reformers called Modero. This group fought for everyone should be entitled to vote, and certainly business class should have more voting right. And they pushed for universal suffrage. Of course, in their idea, it doesn't include women. Their idea is only men should be able to vote. But nonetheless, they are pushing for this voting rights for everyone. The other group was more economic in the sense, um, it's led by peasants, and many people were in like these people were peasants themselves, led by many people, but at the highest level it was led by Zapatas with Marxist ideals. Um, they fought for, they believed that in the Marxist ideals of taking the property from the wealthy uh, landowners and distributing it to the people. So these two groups of people uh, at times working together, and they both attacked the government and establishment in those days, which was basically dictatorship. And then this eventually led to the replacement of government and drafting of new constitution. And for your reference, this is Emiliano Zapata, who I think was had a very short life. If I um, remember, I think he lived. Mm, he lived. I think it's just less than 30 years. And he died in the heights of um, revolution, I think 1990s, and he was assassinated, and he did not live long. But we hear this call, "Viva Zapata," as the farmers used to call. So most of the time was in revolution. Anyway, uh, it's as you see, it's like 1879 to 1919. He had a very short life. But moving on, we will talk about Mexico since colonization and in terms of its foreign relations with the U.S. and Europe. Um, with with all the things which brought in, like when uh, we talk about uh, so we see that yeah, post revolution, we see that um, both these overlapping revolutions, two movements, one from the middle class reformers and one from the peasants, led through the overthrowing of dictatorship. And what came into being, what all this produced is 1917 Constitution, which is what the middle class and both these groups fought for, and it promised that it will be progressive at that time. For its time, the 1917 Constitution was more progressive and it's anti-clerical, which is what middle class movement fought for, and they wanted to control or limit the power of clergy in politics. And it made promises the land would be redistributed and peasants would get more land, and this is what the peasant movement brought in. So there was this both some elements from both these movements included in the 1917 constitution. And kind of going against the Porfiriato, there is a strong policy that foreigners should not be allowed to own property, particularly the land. This was in direct contrast to the Porfiriato policy, where they openly encouraged foreign direct investments. The new constitution of 1917 was totally against for foreign ownership, as in the land ownership. A lot of this was a counter reaction to some of the things that happened earlier, as we can see, uh, the Porfiriato rule that was mainly favorable to foreign direct investment. So moving on, we will see, since we will talk a little bit about the foreign relations of Mexico with the US and Europe. It started off with the throwing off of the Spanish colonialist, but the relationship between US and Mexico tainted due to Texan independence of 1836, and other wars of 1840. There were wars in 1841 and 1848 US invaded Veracruz, and for US to leave, Mexico has to give up the territory of New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and California. And in return, I think Mexico received very little compensation, I think to the tune of $18 million. I think this is why Mexico was shaved, and the Constitution of 1917 banned foreign ownership and had a strong anti-colonial and strong anti-foreign ownership aspect included in the 1917 Constitution. Also, you have Britain and France occupy Veracruz with their ships, and the Louis Napoleon uh, during that time installs his nephew Maximilian from 1864 to 1867. So you see, there is a brief period of monarchy in Mexico, and there is that foreign meddling which is happening in Mexican society. Mm. Then we have Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa is more of a man than a political leader, and at the heights of Zapata movement, they went up to from Mexico to U.S. border, and there is some instance of arms thievery, and that has happened. The result is like, you know, as a result of this, you see the issuing of reward $5,000 for capturing Francesco Pancho Villa. And if you see it, there is a the reward is being published by New Mexico authority. And the US response was obviously it was military, and they sent General Pershing. Now, General Pershing, who went about giving his brutal response, burning of some border towns, and telling Mexicans to control its people uh, and bandits, and and so basically it's about how the brutal response happened. These things changed with the election of. There was a brief um, um, kind of cooperation of sort between U.S. and